A cold, sterile room. Bright fluorescent lights hum overhead. The air is thick with the scent of antiseptic, metal, and something unshakable, finality. A man lies motionless on a gurney, his wrists and ankles secured by thick leather straps. A team of executioners stands nearby, their faces expressionless, their hands steady. This is the end of the road. His sentence has been read. His appeals have been exhausted. The needle is in place. The warden nods. The order is given. A deep breath. His final words hang in the air, barely above a whisper. A plunger is pressed. The first drug enters his veins. A few seconds pass. Then a few more. Something is wrong. The man is still awake. His eyes dart across the room. Panic sets in. Executioners whisper among themselves. Another needle is prepared. They try again. His body tenses. His breathing quickens. The minutes stretch on, yet death refuses to come. Witnesses shift in their seats. The warden's hand clenches into a fist. The execution was supposed to be swift, methodical, absolute. Instead, it's unraveling into chaos. The clock ticks. 20 minutes. 30. An hour. 2. By the end of the night, the unthinkable happens. The execution is called off. The condemned man is carried back to his cell. Alive. This is not an isolated event. Across the years, across different states, inmates sentenced to death have defied their own executions, some enduring botched procedures, others slipping through legal loopholes, and a few simply surviving against all odds. They were strapped down, prepared for death, and yet, they walked away. How does this happen? What went wrong? And what happens next for those who should have died? Tonight, we uncover the true stories of 6 death row inmates who faced the needle, the electric chair, and the hangman's noose, yet lived to tell the tale. For centuries, the death penalty has been the ultimate form of justice. A sentence reserved for those society deems beyond redemption. It is meant to be absolute. Unforgiving. A final reckoning for those who have committed the most unspeakable crimes. Once a judge declares the punishment, there are few roads left. Inmates on death row spend years, sometimes decades, trapped in a state of limbo. Locked inside a 6-by-9-foot cell, counting the days, waiting for the inevitable. For some, appeals offer the faintest glimmer of hope. For others, clemency remains a distant fantasy. The reality is harsh. Once the execution date is set, there are rarely second chances. When the moment arrives, the process is designed to be methodical. Precise. A single misstep could turn a swift execution into an unrelenting horror. The state cannot afford failure. And yet, it happens. Lethal injections that fail to take effect. For lines that collapse under pressure. Inmates gasping for air, convulsing, screaming, refusing to die. Stays of execution arriving with only minutes to spare. Judges making last-minute rulings that send a condemned man back to his cell, unsure of whether he will live another day, or simply be led back to the chamber tomorrow. For most, execution is a sentence carried out without interruption. No last-minute miracles. No errors. But in rare cases, cases that defy expectation, some prisoners have survived. Some have faced death head-on and emerged from the other side. 6 men. 6 stories. Each more shocking than the last. The first. A case so disturbing, so unprecedented, it forced the justice system to reconsider its own limits. A man, strapped to the table, enduring an agonizing 2-hour ordeal that left him bleeding, broken, yet breathing. His name was Rommel Broom. And what happened to him inside the death chamber would change history forever. Case 1, Rommel Broom, the man who lived through his own execution, Ohio, 2009. Crime and sentence. On September 21, 1984, 14-year-old Trina Middleton was walking home from a football game in Cleveland, Ohio, when she vanished. Witnesses saw a dark-colored vehicle trailing her. Days later, her body was found, assaulted, stabbed, and left to die. The evidence pointed to Romel Broom, a convicted sex offender. The jury took little time in sentencing him to death. Execution day, September 15, 2009. Broom was led into the execution chamber at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. Witnesses watched from behind glass. Officials prepared the four-line for the lethal injection. The process was supposed to be swift. Then, something went terribly wrong. The execution team struggled to find a suitable vein. Again and again, they poked the needle into Broom's arms, hands, legs, and feet, 18 times in total. Blood pooled beneath him. His face contorted in agony. He writhed against the restraints, moaning, pleading for relief. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then 2. The drugs never entered his bloodstream. The executioners had failed. For the first time in Ohio history, a man had survived a lethal injection. Aftermath. Broom was returned to his cell, alive. Ohio planned to try again, but years of legal battles followed. He spent 11 more years on death row, outliving the very officials who had tried to end his life. In 2020, COVID-19 finally did what the state of Ohio could not. Romel Broom died behind bars at the age of 64. A man sentenced to die, outlived his executioner. Case 2, Doyle Lee Ham, the man who bled for 2 hours, Alabama, 2018. Crime and sentence. In 1987, Doyle Lee Ham walked into a motel in Cullman, Alabama, pulled out a gun, and fatally shot the clerk, Patrick Cunningham. The murder was part of a robbery spree that left a trail of victims. The court had no hesitation. Ham was sentenced to die. Execution day, February 22, 2018. Decades later, Ham was strapped to the execution table. The warden signaled for the lethal injection to begin. But there was a problem. Ham had been battling cancer for years. Chemotherapy had left his veins fragile, nearly impossible to locate. The execution team tried anyway. Over and over, they punctured his body, searching for a vein that could carry the fatal drugs. His arms. His legs. His groin. Blood spilled onto the gurney. The process dragged on for 2 agonizing hours. Ham gasped, shaking as they stabbed him again and again. Finally, they gave up. What happened next? The state of Alabama abandoned its efforts to execute him. Ham was sent back to his cell, where he lived for 3 more years. In 2021, his cancer won the battle. He died peacefully in his sleep, a death far less violent than what the state had planned for him. Case 3, Alva Campbell, the man who couldn't be killed, Ohio, 2017. Crime and sentence. In 1997, Alva Campbell faked paralysis to avoid being shackled in court. When deputies helped him into a wheelchair, he took advantage of the moment, grabbing an officer's gun, escaping custody, and murdering 18-year-old Charles Dials in a desperate bid for freedom. The jury sentenced him to death. Execution day, November 15, 2017. Campbell was wheeled into the death chamber, too weak to walk. The execution team prepared to administer the lethal injection. But as they searched for a vein, they realized there was a problem. Campbell's body was too deteriorated. His health had declined so much that he couldn't even lie flat on the execution table without suffocating. After 25 minutes of failed attempts to find a vein, Ohio's governor made a decision: cancel the execution. The twist? The state never tried again. 1 year later, in 2018, Campbell died in his prison bed from natural causes. He spent 21 years on death row, only to leave life on his own terms. Case 4, Willie Jasper Darden Jr., the man who his execution was scheduled, then delayed. Then scheduled again, only to be postponed once more. 3 separate times, he faced the certainty of death, only to be spared by legal appeals. But luck could only last so long. Final outcome. In 1988, after 14 years of delays, Florida carried out the sentence. Darden was electrocuted in the state's electric chair. Some believe he was innocent. But in the end, the justice system refused to let him escape a 4th time. Case 5, Henry Skinner, the man who beat death for decades, Texas, 1993 to 2023. Crime and sentence. In 1993, Henry Skinner was convicted of a brutal triple homicide in Pampa, Texas. He had always maintained his innocence, arguing that key DNA evidence had never been tested. Close calls. Skinner had multiple execution dates over the course of 30 years. Each time, appeals saved his life, sometimes with only hours to spare. In 2010, he came within 1 hour of execution before the Supreme Court intervened. Final fate. For decades, Skinner fought for new DNA testing, arguing it would prove his innocence. But the courts refused to listen. In 2023, after years of dodging execution, his fight ended. COVID-19 took him before the state of Texas could. Case 6, Tommy Arthur, the man who escaped death 7 times, Alabama, 1982 to 2017. Crime and sentence. Arthur was convicted of a murder-for-hire scheme in 1982. The evidence against him was strong. The courts wasted no time in sentencing him to death. 7 execution dates. Arthur became known as Houdini on death row. Each time the state set an execution date, a legal technicality saved his life. 7 separate times, Alabama prepared to execute him. 7 times, he walked away. But the luck ran out. In 2017, the state refused to delay any longer. Tommy Arthur was executed after 34 years of fighting the system. 6 men. 6 executions that never happened the way they were supposed to. Some walked away from the table, still breathing. Others spent years watching the clock, waiting for the state to try again. They had been sentenced to die. Yet some of them outlived their executioners. For decades, the execution chamber has been the final destination for the condemned. It is supposed to be efficient, controlled, unwavering. A place where the law delivers its most severe punishment with absolute precision. But when that precision fails, when the needle doesn't work, when the drugs don't take effect, when the condemned are left suffering instead of slipping away, the entire system is thrown into question. How does this happen? The science of a botched execution. Lethal injection, the most common execution method in the United States, was designed to be humane. A carefully measured sequence of chemicals meant to induce unconsciousness, paralyze the body, and stop the heart, all within minutes. A process that, on paper, should be no more complex than administering anesthesia before surgery. Yet, time and time again, something goes wrong. Medical incompetence. Execution teams are often not trained medical professionals. Doctors take an oath to do no harm, so licensed physicians rarely participate. Instead, it falls to prison staff, some with little experience in inserting IVs, to carry out the procedure. Veins collapse. The wrong dosage is administered. A simple slip of the hand can turn an execution into prolonged torture. Faulty drugs. The pharmaceutical industry has distanced itself from capital punishment. Many drug manufacturers refuse to sell their products for executions, forcing states to turn to alternative or unregulated sources. Expired drugs. Unapproved cocktails. Substitutes that have never been tested. The result? Inmates left conscious, aware, gasping for air while their bodies shut down. A cruel twist of fate. Some believe that when a person survives execution, it's a sign, divine intervention, fate stepping in at the last moment. Others see it as the ultimate failure of a system designed to end life with precision. When Rommel Broom writhed on the table for 2 hours, when Doyleham bled through his prison uniform, when Alva Campbell suffocated in his own wheelchair, the question arose, what now? Should these men, having endured an execution attempt, be returned to their cells and forced to wait for the next scheduled date? Or has the state already exacted its punishment? The moral dilemma: when the state fails to kill, should it try again? The law provides no clear answer. In some cases, states have abandoned execution attempts altogether, quietly allowing nature to take its course. In others, the government has doubled down, resetting execution dates as if the first attempt was nothing more than a failed appointment. For some, the argument is simple: a death sentence is a death sentence. The state is legally bound to carry it out, regardless of how many attempts it takes. For others, a botched execution is punishment enough. If the condemned survives, have they not already endured a form of cruel and unusual punishment? Should they be granted clemency, not because they are innocent, but because the system itself failed in a way that should not be ignored? The debate rages on. And yet, for all the legal battles and ethical questions, one thing remains certain: when the system stumbles, when execution day turns into a horror show, it is not just the condemned who are affected. The witnesses, the executioners, the families of the victims, all must carry the weight of what they have seen. What does justice look like when the act of delivering it becomes its own kind of horror? That is a question no court can answer. The gurney is rolled away. The execution chamber is left in silence. But the story does not end there. For every botched execution, a legal and ethical firestorm erupts, one that reaches beyond the walls of the prison, beyond the condemned, beyond even the executioners. It stretches into the courts, the legislature, and the homes of the victims' families. The Supreme Court's view on failed executions. The U.S. Supreme Court has been confronted with a chilling question: if a person survives an execution attempt, should they be spared? The answer, so far, has been no. The court has ruled that a failed execution does not mean the sentence is void. If the state botches one attempt, it can try again. In Francis v. Resweber, 1947, Willie Francis, a 17-year-old black teenager sentenced to death in Louisiana, was strapped into the electric chair. The switch was thrown. Sparks flew. But the currents failed to kill him. Guards pulled him from the chair, dazed and confused. The state planned a second execution. Francis appealed, arguing that a second attempt would violate the Eighth Amendment's protection against cruel and unusual punishment. The Supreme Court disagreed. 5 justices ruled that it was not the pain of the failed execution that mattered, but the fact that his sentence, death, had not yet been carried out. The ruling set a precedent that has stood for decades. The justice system allows the state to try again, no matter how horrifying the first attempt may have been. But does that mean it should? New execution methods, a solution or more horror? The failures of lethal injection have forced states to seek alternatives. Not to eliminate the death penalty, but to perfect it. Several states are now turning to nitrogen gas, an untested method that deprives the body of oxygen, supposedly leading to unconsciousness before death. Proponents claim it will be painless. Critics fear it will be another nightmare in disguise. Others have revived an old method, the firing squad. Bullets, unlike chemicals, do not rely on veins or precise dosages. Utah, South Carolina, and Oklahoma have all approved firing squads as a backup method. Will these options prevent future botched executions? Or will they create a new chapter of horror, one where men suffocate in a gas chamber or bleed out before a row of executioners? Families of the victims, justice delayed, but not denied. For the families of murder victims, the death penalty is often seen as closure. The moment where justice is finally delivered. The final chapter. But when an execution fails, it rips that closure away. It forces them to relive their loss, again and again, while the person who took their loved one's life continues to exist, even if only for a little longer. Some fight for the state to try again, demanding that justice be carried through to its end. Others, seeing the horror of a botched execution, question whether the process itself is a punishment too cruel to continue. For some, watching the condemned struggle on the gurney only deepens the pain, making them ask, did justice just turn into revenge? Or worse, did it turn into torture? These questions have no easy answers. But as the death penalty continues to evolve, one thing remains certain: the act of execution is not as simple, clean, or controlled as the state would like the world to believe. And for those who survive the impossible, who walk away from the brink of death, what remains is a chilling truth. No matter how precise the system claims to be, death is never guaranteed. As the chilling reality of these failed executions sinks in, we're left with the undeniable truth: the death penalty isn't just a legal matter, it's a moral one, a question of whether the state should ever be allowed to take a life, and what happens when it fails. But there's one last question for you to consider. Do you think someone who survives an execution should be given life in prison instead? Or should the state keep trying? The idea of second chances, or the relentless pursuit of justice, is a dilemma that has sparked debates for centuries. But in a world where the very systems designed to end life can sometimes fail, where does the line between justice and cruelty get drawn? Let me know in the comments. Your opinion might change someone's mind. There's a conversation here that needs to be had, and your voice could be the one to start it. And if you found this case disturbing, trust me, there's more where that came from. Hit subscribe so you never miss a case. This channel is your front row seat to some of the most haunting, mysterious, and twisted stories that the world has to offer. Remember, this isn't just about the crimes, they're about the systems we've built to address them. The failures. The mistakes. The lives that hang in the balance. And ultimately, the question of what happens when justice is denied. So, if you want to keep exploring this dark, twisted world with me, make sure to subscribe. Because there's always more to uncover in the shadows. See you in the next case.